Hi, everybody, and welcome to Dunn's Garage. On this episode, we will be showcasing another one of the big car shows that we went to over summer of 2025. This specific one being the Volksfest in Central Ohio, located at the Columbus Convention Center. This particular show is put on by the Central Ohio Vintage Volkswagen Club, and they've been putting this show on for every year since 1991. There were a few years during COVID where it got a bit dicey, but aside from that, they've been going strong, going into their fourth decade. So this show draws hundreds of cars, usually about 300, and a few thousand spectators, and it is generally a great time. While in their name they do call themselves the Vintage Volkswagen Club, it is branched out over the last few years to include more than just the standard vintage Volkswagens. They welcome a variety of air-cooled, water-cooled, military vehicles, and really everything in between when it comes to Volkswagens. And in addition, there's usually a few other people that come around. Plenty of Porsche guys, some Mercedes people, and the odd air-cooled Honda or two. I myself have been coming to this show essentially my entire life. The first show I was at was in 2000 in August. And I will point out that I was born August of 1999, and this show happens in the second week of every August. And so that means I was barely not a year old. So we've kind of made this family tradition for years. It's always happened around my birthday. It's always a good time. As you can see in the background, we are pulling into the History Center at the Columbus Convention Center complex. They have the show in the parking lot. It's not a bad venue. In the past, they've done it at some local high schools. To be honest, in prior years, they did it to high schools to the east of Columbus, which was far better for us because this happens smack in the middle of the Mopar Nationals weekend that we also go to in the Columbus area. So that's why you can see in the video we are driving my dad's Dodge Dart, and it is in the middle of the other show, but we always make time to come down to the Volkswagen show. And as you can see, it's a fairly big show. Unfortunately, a lot of the old school Volkswagen shows seem to be getting smaller and smaller every year. I don't know what exactly is driving that, other than that particular generation of air cooled guys passing on and not as many people picking up the mantle. I have also noticed at the same time, old air cooled VWs have plummeted in pricing, whereas things like Mopars only go up higher. But that is a conversation for another video. As you can see next to us, there's a variety of cars that are also pulling into the show in a variety of conditions. One thing I will always say, the whole patina and a quote-unquote originality thing is in at the moment with all kinds of cars. But the whole don't get it right, get it running thing has kind of always been a Volkswagen thing. As I said, I've been coming to the show for the better part of 2.5 decades, and there have always been cars in the process or cars that are barely making it there, and that's just part of the ethos of Volkswagens. And with that, we'll kind of cut into the next part of the show. Here we get to one of my favorite parts of these car shows, and that is the swap meet and kind of car corral areas. At Volksfest, they're kind of one and the same thing. You tend to see a lot of project cars up on trailers, and this is no exception. Here we have a Mercedes kit car sitting on a shortened Volkswagen chassis. This one's actually a pretty decent one. Some of them kind of get chintzy, but they're very simple cars. That one's just a fiberglass body on top of a modified chassis. Going beyond that, you tend to see some more standard project cars like the one there. To be honest, this show usually has a pretty decent swap meet. This year was a bit less, but this show was a bit less in general, so you kind of expect that. Um, in a lot of these Volkswagen shows, particularly being in Ohio, you tend to see them filled with a lot of sheet metal, particularly from other parts of the world where cars tend to live a bit longer. In the past, I've done fairly well at these. I picked up some new old stock parts for my own air-cooled Volkswagen, which is something I'll have to do a video on in the near future, but that is quite the project of its own. As you can see here, this one's pretty good. Like, this here is a early oval window Volkswagen body, and it's pretty complete sheet metal wise. and it's not in that bad a shape, particularly with how rare the oval windows have gotten recently. And as you can see from the front end there, it's much better than most of the ones around here. And it comes with a pan that actually had floors, which is kind of an odd thing for Ohio. But one issue with that, as you can see there, is somebody went to the effort to start to chop it and then kind of gave up, which is probably why it's sitting in a swap meet. But those things can be fixed these days, particularly with how rare some of these older air-cooled Volkswagens are getting. You can also see there a variety of both OE and aftermarket parts. I was going to say sheet metal, but those aren't sheet metal because they're fiberglass. That's quite the common thing when it comes to old Volkswagens. They're one of the most customizable cars there are. And there were a lot of companies, both past and present, who made a variety of sheet metal parts that were in fiberglass. This here was actually something I was very tempted by because it was a full car for $600 and it wasn't that rotted. You can see again there, that's a Baja kit in fiberglass. I've always wanted to build one of those, but too many ideas, not enough time and money. But as you can see as we kind of go through here, there's not just air-cooled Volkswagen parts, there's some more modern parts, as well as just vintage camping gear and other vintage items in general. This show kind of attracts more of that crowd that's looking for antiques and camping equipment in particular because there are so many vintage van campers here, and that attracts that kind of crowd. Normally, I'm not the biggest fan of having just crap in a lot of these swap meets, but vintage camping gear at this kind of shows par for the course. One thing I will note about some of the vendors at these shows is they are the quote unquote professional types that have what they call high quality vintage sheet metal that cost $1 million. And that's just par for the course at all of these shows. It's not nearly as bad as the Mopar shows, so I guess I shouldn't complain too much. As you can see here, there's also a bunch of other nicer cars that were for sale. The vintage and air-cooled Volkswagen market is very interesting. Right now, they're in quite a low. I remember about the 2015-16 era, $5,000 bought you something rotted out and that needed extensive work. Now, not so much. $5,000 buys you a decent car, which is odd because you've seen other cars in that same period of time go from worthless to costing $1 million, like a Buddy Mopars, for instance. So now we're getting to the more expensive portion of the swap meet. I don't know why beyond the rarity, but Volkswagen vans, particularly the van trucks, are insanely expensive. That being said, they're very cool and I've always wanted one. Now, these in front of us are Bradley GT kit cars. These typically aren't worth, well, anything. I've always found them cool, though. Once again, they are a fiberglass body on top of a shortened Volkswagen chassis, and they're in the shape of a sports car. I don't know if I would call them a sports car, but they are cool, and they have some old school movie cred. So now we're getting into the actual show itself, and you can see in the background, as I alluded to earlier, there are a great deal of vans at this event, and camper vans in particular. It seems that the core of the Central Ohio Vintage Volkswagen Club is camper vans. A lot of their events seem to surround around drives and other events where they all get together and camp and get out and see the countryside with vintage vans. And that's cool. A friend of mine, his dad, about a year ago, bought a Brazilian camper van out of Mexico, which is its own interesting story and a very interesting car. They came with 1.8 liter water cooled engines, which I didn't know. But that's a story for another day. And back to the show. You can see that there are a wide variety of camper vans, not just the old air-cooled stuff. You can see the blue car there is a synchro water-cooled van, which is very cool in a multitude of ways. The synchro vans had a all-wheel drive system that was inspired by Audi, and they weren't quite four-wheel drive, but they were close. You can also see, like, that particular van right there is a different type of camper van because it doesn't pop up, it pops open at a 90 degree. And that is the really cool thing about this particular show is I don't really recall any time where we've seen a larger collection of more interesting Volkswagens. We've been into Volkswagens my entire life, and we've gone to quite a few VW specific shows. There's one in Geneva, there's one in the Toledo area, and we've done really all of them that happen in our little neck of the woods, and none of them really compare to this. Unfortunately, a few of them have gone by the wayside. There used to be a very good one in Ravenna, Ohio, that actually happened at the same time as this particular show, and that might be the reason why it kind of died out. But it was a good time nonetheless. And this one is as well, and I would encourage everybody out there watching to come to this one next year. And now, as you can see, we're getting into some of the more modern cars that were at the show, particularly that of late model Rabbits and Cabriolets. Very interesting fact with Cabriolets is they tended to last longer than their equivalent Rabbit or Golf. What that means is the square nose Rabbits lasted quite far into the 1990s when the other ones were replaced by the rounder Golfs, and then that carried forward for a little bit. What that means is you can get a much more vintage era Cabriolet that's far newer. And because of that, as well as, to be honest, they're just not that desirable. They tend to be very cheap at the moment, certainly in October of 2025. And now we're kind of getting into the slightly older Rabbits, a lot of pickup trucks. I have some very evil ideas for Rabbit pickup trucks, but that's a project for another day. But it is interesting to see these cars go from just cars when I was a kid to now they're very collectible vintage vehicles. And part of that is just these didn't survive well in Northeast Ohio. And so the ones that are around need to be restored. And because of that, they've been relegated to passion projects. And just time has gone by and changed what they were. I remember when I was in high school looking at that era of Volkswagen as just a car, and now it's something special that people restore and take to car shows, which is interesting. And now we're kind of getting into the new stuff that, I'll be honest, we don't particularly have any interest in. There's always some affiliation with local VW dealerships, and because of that, they put some of their cars in the show, which is unfortunate, although that is one very interesting Porsche 914, which you tend to see Mercedes and Porsches and Audis at these shows, particularly that style of one where they are kind of the bare bones, inexpensive car. But with that, we will move on. So now we get to my personal favorite row, and to be honest, the reason why we cut a big section of the Mopar Nationals weekend out of every weekend each year, and that's the Volkswagen Beetles. So I personally have a 1975 VW Beetle. Was originally a fuel injection car. All that's gone. Still have the locked up EFI engine though. No use for it, but it's torn into a million pieces and in process, but it is in process. But in addition to that, you see some Porsches off to the side, a couple 928s, which is one of those cars that I have always wanted. I blame risky business and Top Gear. But with that, you can kind of see just the variety of cars at the show. And once again, we are to some VW Rabbit pickup trucks. One thing I will note about this year of the show was there seemed to be far fewer VW Beetles and other air-cooled Volkswagens, and quite a few more of the later 80s and 90s Rabbit-based cars. I don't know if that means that the air-cooled guys are on their way out or just that the rabbit guys are on their way in, but it's a thing nonetheless. And we're kind of getting into some of the newer sections of vans. The Euro vans are always interesting. They are demanding stupid money these days. All the ones that were at the show were $20,000 to $25,000, which is too much for a Euro van. I'm sorry if you have one and you love it, but that's too much. And now we're getting to kind of the largest thing that was at the show, an old flexible bus. And that is spelled FLXIBLE. And these are very interesting. My dad always has to stop at this bus and talk about how he rode on the Goodyear ones that took people to Wingfoot Lake back in the day. But these buses were originally made in Loudonville, Ohio. And if that sounds familiar, you probably watched our Loudonville video where we went to their 4th of July car show. If you haven't, you should check it out. It was a very interesting car show. But those buses were produced for a very extended period of time. They made buses and sidecars and other coach-built vehicles from 1913 to 1996. That bus is from somewhere in the late 40s, early 50s era. It's hard to tell. That body extended for a very long period of time, and as they were coach built, they tended to see a fair amount of modification. But with that, we'll get back to the rest of the show. As we get back to the show, you'll see yet another non-Volkswagen type of car that comes with these, that being GM Corvairs. So Corvairs were essentially Chevy's attempt to make a competitor to Porsche and Volkswagen. Their big buses were obviously competitors to the VW bus, and they made smaller, sportier, rear-engined flat 6 and flat 4 cars, and they attempted to compete with VWs, but Corvairs weren't necessarily all that successful. They are a very interesting car. My grandmother had one, and have a bit of a soft spot for them there. But we don't see too many of them at these shows, to be honest. We don't see too many of them anywhere. That was a very nice red one. I wish I had some better video of it. But as we're kind of getting into the Beetles, we get into the bread and butter of the Volkswagen community, certainly the air-cooled. They made 21.5 million air-cooled Beetles by time their production ended in 2003, and they made them all over the world, from Germany to Brazil, and just about everywhere in between. So with that, I'm going to start going through some of the specific cars that really stood out at the show. In front of me is a VW Corrado, which I've always wanted one. To be honest, I was going to buy one when I was in high school, but in between deciding to go look at a specific one and actually going to do it, we found my Jeep YJ that ended up being my first car. So, no Corrado for me. Here we have one of the more oddball cars that you tend to see at these Volkswagen shows, which is saying a lot considering it's a Volkswagen show. So this is a VW thing. These were produced for the United States market from 1973 to 1974, meaning there weren't very many of them that came into the States, approximately 25,000. And what's fairly obvious with it is kind of a attempt at a German Jeep. And what it is based off of essentially was that. It was based off of the German military car, the Kubelwagen, and it's essentially a civilian version, the same as Jeeps are in the United States. One issue with the thing is that it is two-wheel drive and essentially on a modified VW Beetle platform, meaning it has a bit of the looks, but it is not anything other than just a passenger car. It's also very odd that it came in a four-door variant as opposed to things like Jeeps or Rovers that came in much smaller packages. Ironic that it is much smaller given that the thing is not particularly big, but this was a design that kind of carried over from its time as an officer's car in the military, and it was expected to seat at least four. This particular thing has a cage attached to it, even though, again, it's really nothing more than a passenger car. but a very interesting car and very, very collectible in the United States, as again, they only imported about 25,000 of them over a 2 year period of time, and they had the typical air cooled Volkswagen rust issues. Here we have what is arguably the holy grail of collectible vintage VWs. This is a 21 window Volkswagen bus. These were produced from 1964 to 1967. As you can see along the top of the car, there are a number of additional windows that you wouldn't normally see in a standard bus. And in addition, it has a full length rag top, which was a very odd thing for the era. I think it's something that is interesting that has kind of come again, where you tend to see minivans and Dodge pickup trucks with massive full length moon roofs. But back in the day, that was an extraordinarily rare thing to see. And really, to my knowledge, these VW buses were the only things that you could get in that kind of configuration. And because of that rarity and the fact that all of those extra windows and the rag tops typically led to a great deal of water leakage into the car, these buses are extremely rare and very valuable. You tend to see them on a lot of the popular shows. I remember back in the day watching both Fast and Loud and Bitchin' Rides doing VW buses and thinking that that was a very odd thing as they tended to gravitate more towards the muscle car stuff. But it's very interesting to see one in person and one that drove there. Talking to the owners, they do a fair amount of driving with it, and that's not something you necessarily see all the time. So here we have something that I'll be honest, I never expected to see in the United States. I did see a fair amount of them when I lived in Europe, but this is a Volkswagen LT35 van. This particular model is from 1995, and what these are the full-size vans that VW has made, and they're fairly common to a degree around Europe. So this particular one, being a 35, is the 3.5-ton variation, and that means that it came with, at the time, the biggest and most powerful engine, which was a 2.4-liter inline six-cylinder, making a whopping 93 horsepower. Now, that's a very interesting choice for a full-size van, particularly that late into the 1990s. You would expect that there'd be some alternative, but you have to keep in mind a lot of these were designed for specific types of European roadways, and they weren't exactly designed to be highway cruisers or long-haul vehicles. That's just not the same kind of thing there that it is here. Albeit Germany is slightly different given that they are the ones who invented the Autobahn, but that is a tangent for a whole nother time. This is a very interesting car to see here. Talking to the owner, he imported it out of Poland, and he didn't exactly have a lot of details on that, which is unfortunate because it would be interesting to know what the process would be. We have seen a variety of foreign, particularly Volkswagens, coming into the country recently that normally wouldn't legally be licensable on American roads. A lot of the later model air-cooled stuff out of Mexico and South American countries, and evidently some oddball European stuff. And that's really due to the fact that a lot of these cars are hitting that 25-year mark, and that means that a lot of states waive emissions exemptions and other factors that keep them from being licensable on American roads. But it's very interesting to see, and I'm curious as to how that trend's going to continue going forwards. Here's one of the more interesting vans that we saw at the show. This is a stubby or a short bus, and what they did to achieve this was they cut the van in half and cut a few feet out of the center of it. These were relatively common back in the day, nothing all that common as they kind of ruined the whole purpose of the van. But one very funny thing that they tend to do without all of the weight from the middle of the van is they tend to wheelie very well. These vans have the biggest of the air-cooled VW engines, and like all the others, it's located in the back. So when you cut the whole middle out, you don't need that much power to lift the front end. with that, we are at an end, and I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in this week. And I would ask all of you just a little thing: a like and a subscribe goes a long way to keeping us at this.